Hello everyone, in this video we'll be looking at some possible tutorial questions from chapter 22, and chapter 22 sums up fiscal policy, and it looks more on the dynamics of deficits and debt, and it also looks at some problems that relate to high government debt or high public debt, you can say. So question 1 says fiscal policy has been found to be a very good instrument to address problems such as increasing output, liquidity trap, and other problems facing policymakers. However, we have been ignoring fiscal policy constraints such as budget constraint. Question 1a. Discuss government budget constraint. So the government budget constraints links the changes in government debt to the initial level of debt and to current government spending and taxes. This means that according to the government budget constraint, the changes in government debt during a particular year is equal to the deficit during that same year. And this also takes into account the interest payments. Question 1b. Distinguish debt and deficit. So here I would like to start by distinguishing a deficit because it helps us understand the definition of a debt. So the deficit is how much the government borrows during a given year, and the debt is what the government owes as a result of past deficit. So that means a debt is a store, it's a collection of past deficits, and the deficit is how much a government borrows in a particular year. Okay. Question 2. Discuss what happens to government debt if the following happens. So, A. What will happen to government debt if the government runs a deficit? And B. What will happen to the government debt if government runs a surplus? So, according to the definitions we've just given above, when a government runs a deficit, that means a government is borrowing, right? So the government debt increases as the government borrows to fund the part or spending in excess of revenues. So we know that government has some income, and to fund spending, they use that income. But when the spending is in excess of the revenues that they have, then government go for borrowing, and that means they are running a deficit, and therefore the government debt will increase. What will happen to government debt if the government runs a surplus? So in a case where government runs a surplus, you say that government is repaying part of a loan or part of an outstanding debt, right? So when the government runs a surplus, government debt decreases as the government uses a budget surplus to repay part of its government debt. Okay, moving on to question 3. Now imagine that Mozambican government borrowed certain amount of money from South Africa in year 1. However, fearing a high debt burden, it takes a decision of thinking about repaying it fully in year 2. As an economist, what would you advise Mozambican government to do to meet their intention of fully repaying the debt? So this question takes you and places you as an advisor. So that means whatever you answer this question, you are going to answer it according to your own means. But it's very important that whatever you give as an answer, it is backed by theory and it makes sense according to the theory. Okay. So we say to avoid a further increase in debt during year 1, the Mozambican government must run a primary surplus. That means must repay that outstanding debt. A surplus then must be equal to the real interest payments on the existing debt. So we know that a debt or a loan has interest on it. So for them to be able to repay that debt fully in the period that they want to repay the debt, they must run a primary surplus. But also the surplus must be equal to interest payments on that loan, so that they do not think that they have repaid a loan and find out that they still have an excess money to pay coming from the interest. Okay. Question 3a. What does increasing taxes imply to people's livelihood? So there are many ways that a government can fund themselves, right? So, and one of them is increasing taxes. So increasing taxes implies that there will be a decrease in consumption, because when interests are high, when taxes are high, people tend to decrease their consumption, right? So a decrease in consumption will depend on the expectations of a consumer. So the longer the consumer expects higher taxes to last, the more they will decrease their consumption. So that is what increasing taxes imply on people's livelihood. There will be a decrease in their consumption. Question 3b. As an economist, would you advise that government stabilize the debt through taxes? Explain your answer. And again, as I said when I was starting, we explain all of this um, according to your own ways, but it should be backed by theory. So there are many ways to explain question 3b. You can say yes and you can say no. But let's just say yes. Government can increase taxes to stimulate the economy and stabilize the debt. But sometimes increases in taxes are not enough, and therefore government would maybe cut spending at the same time while increasing taxes to be able to stabilize the debt and stimulate the economy. And some of the ways that a government can do that, you can say no to increasing taxes and say that maybe a government could issue bonds. Because when government wants to fund themselves, sometimes they issue bonds and they take the money from the investor or from the banks, because sometimes they issue bonds to the banks. They take their money and they repay the loan um, with the funds that they got from issuing the bonds. Or you can say no again and focus on the net exports, right? So if you remember the aggregate expenditure formula, we have aggregate expenditure equals to C plus I plus G plus X minus M for the open economy. So looking at X and minus M, that is net exports. And if exports are higher than imports, we're talking about surplus. And if imports are higher than exports, we're talking about a deficit. So you can relate your answer to that and talk about increasing exports and decreasing imports so that the government can run a surplus and therefore fund themselves to be able to repay loan and stabilize the economy. Okay, so that's it for this video. Thank you so much.